23 million South Africans are living in poverty, according to the latest Poverty Trends report released by Statistics South Africa. The report highlights that more than a third of the population subsists below the country's lower bound poverty line. The new figures show a modest decline in poverty since 2015, but Statistician-General Risenga Maluleke warned that progress remains slow and many households continue to struggle to afford the basic necessities. We're now joined by Mervyn, the program coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. Mr. Abrahams, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. So the report indicates a significant decline in poverty over the past 17 years, but provinces such as the KZN, the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, as well as the Northwest continue to face the highest poverty rates. What factors do you believe are the biggest contributors to most of these persistent regional disparities?
So good morning, Katlego, and good morning to all your viewers. So when we look at poverty rates and we look at where its highest concentrations are in the provinces that you have mentioned, it's often to do with the economy of those provinces. It has to do with the job rates. For instance, in KwaZulu-Natal, you would also note that it's the most densely populated. And we have significant levels of unemployment within this province, even though there is also a lot of industry in this province. Of course, in the Eastern Cape, very little industry and very high levels of unemployment, very few possibilities of job creation, and the same applies to the Northwest. And so that's the kind of problem, economic and labor market issues that afflict some of these provincials and show these disparities across provinces.
So you speak about very few job opportunities that may exist in many of these provinces. Now, over 71% of the poor are under the age of 35, with children constituting about 43.1% of those who are poor. How should social and economic policies be tailored to address poverty amongst young people, and what role do you think education as well as employment programs can play?
So, Katlego, for us, reading through the poverty trends as released, the most worrisome aspect of this report is the persistent high levels of child poverty and what that actually means in terms of intergenerational poverty cycles when these children come out of their age group. So we have to, and if you connect it, if you look very carefully, for instance, then you will see, for instance, that the child support grant, which supports many of these children, are way below the food poverty line, let alone the upper bound poverty line. So it's a clear indication that if we want to eradicate childhood poverty, that we are at the very least going to have to increase the child support grant from 560, where it is currently, to the level of the food poverty line of 796. What that would do is it would be able to stabilize at least the level of food security in the households. And that would then translate into better economic outcomes, because a hungry child cannot learn. Better economic or educational outcomes, it would lead to better health outcomes and eventually to better economic productivity outcomes when these children enter the labor market. So that is for us the most critical aspect of what we have taken from this poverty trend report by Stats SA.
You mentioned the upper bound in terms of the poverty lines, and the report uses multiple poverty lines, the food lower bound as well as the upper bound. How do these different thresholds influence policy priorities, and which line do you believe most accurately captures the reality of poverty in our country?
So it really is very difficult to say what actually, because poverty is also not a uniform reality. You know, it manifests itself in different forms across. So whilst these are useful in terms of policymakers, we believe that the upper bound poverty line which is currently set at 1,634, best express what it requires for a person, not a household, a single person, to be able to navigate purchases of basic necessities and accessing basic necessities. So we would go for the upper bound poverty line. Then, of course, as you've mentioned, there is the food poverty line of 796 Rand. Below that, it's inconceivable for a person to be able to be food secure. So that's what that food poverty line shows. But now, if we branch out, if we look at the general economy, and for instance, we look at the national minimum wage, we will see that in the month of November, the national minimum wage would have brought in something in the region of 4,606 Rand. Now, when you take the two biggest or the two immediate expenses, so transport would cost that work about 1,600, and electricity will cost about 1,100 for that worker's household. What is then left is something in the region of 2,781. And when you divide that amongst 4 persons in a household, you arrive at 454 Rand, which is way below the food poverty line. So what that actually tells us is, number one, that income levels like the child support grant, the national minimum wage, is much too low in order to meet basic needs. And it also tells us that essential services like transport and electricity is way too high for it to allow for workers and their households to live in some form of dignity. So actually, most national minimum wage earners, their households would fall in poverty. So that's some of the levels of inequality in South Africa that policymakers are going to have to look at. What is the level of incomes that we need to have, and to ensure that the expenditure like transport, electricity, and food prices remain within a particular margin so that we actually can eradicate some of this poverty.
Very lastly, Mervyn, with regards to your point there in terms of how we measure this, I mean, there's also that shift from rural to urban poverty, which now highlights a change in the dynamics. How should policies adapt to such a shift?
So we know, for instance, that rural poverty is much deeper than urban poverty. And it's very simply because in the urban context, you know, you can make your way around things. If you're in Johannesburg, you can find a little job here, you can beg for money there, etc. These are opportunities that don't exist in your rural areas. So what we have to do in the rural areas is we have to begin to bring industry into the rural areas. Now, in order to do that, we might need to subsidize logistics, and we might need to subsidize some form of industry to make it possible for industry to move into the rural areas and create the possibility of economic development there that the country requires.
All right, Mervyn, thank you so much for your time. Certainly a lot of work that still needs to be done to shift some of those poverty levels and poverty lines. That was Mervyn Abrahams, the program coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group.